Hey, this is Jamey from Stonemeyer Games, and I'm saying this in such a formal way because I'm going to eventually put this video up on YouTube, but right now I'm filming it specifically for Playful by Design, which I was invited to participate in remotely and in advance by Alexis. You all have put together an amazing set of questions here, and it's a long set of questions, so I'm going to be fairly succinct in my answers. But because this will be on YouTube later, if you have any follow-up questions, just check it out on my YouTube channel, and I am very happy to answer or go deeper into these questions in the comments there. So I'll kind of rattle through these. Hopefully I'll try to stay succinct so this isn't too long, but these questions were really amazing. Thank you for taking the time to think of them. So we start off actually with a question from Alexis herself. She says, what are considerations that need to be made when designing for international audiences? And two things that come to mind. I'll go deeper into this in another question in a minute. But two things that come to mind are one, language dependence versus independence, I think is something to think about. At Stonemeyer Games, we make a wide variety of games. We publish them in English, and then we work with localization partners for them to translate the games. We handle production, and they we manufacture them, but they handle distribution in their region. And one thing I learned that's kind of surprised me is I assumed that these partners would prefer language independence. So like cards that use text instead, or use icons instead of text to convey how the card works. However, I learned from our localization partners that they actually prefer language dependent games because that means they can kind of ensure that they get to sell the product opposed to someone just buying the English version of the game and downloading a localized rulebook or translating the rulebook themselves. So that was surprising to me to learn. The one other thing that I'll touch on a little bit later too is that we have started hiring a cultural consultant for our games. The intent behind this is that there are a lot of different cultures out there, a lot of different people in the world. I try to look at our games through kind of the lens of inclusivity and being welcome to people around the world from different cultures. But I am far from an expert on that. And so we've started hiring on a game-by-game basis, a product-by-product basis, an expert to review all of the art, all the cards, even the mechanisms on some level in our games to make sure that we aren't causing unintentional harm, something that we've been very aware of over the last few years. Sometimes our best intents and our best intentions end up accidentally harming someone. So we want to avoid that, and this cultural consultant has helped quite a bit with that. Dan has some great questions here. Dan's first question is, do you recommend particular platforms or organizations other than Kickstarter for indie game designers interested in crowdfunding? How should designers shop for a crowdfunding site? So there are, I would say, three somewhat major crowdfunding sites now for tabletop games. The main one is still Kickstarter. It very much is Kickstarter. There's also GameFound, which is growing and specifically focused on games. And there's also Game on Tabletop, which is much smaller, but still very focused on games. So I really like that GameFound and Game on Tabletop are becoming more and more substantial platforms. Both are very viable platforms, I think, for crowdfunders to use. GameFound so far has been for some pretty big games. They're not really focusing on smaller games yet. And so if you haven't already made a name for yourself as a designer or publisher, I don't know if GameFound will even accept you at this point as a potential creator. But they'll get to that point. I think they're getting to that point of letting anyone launch a game on their platform. Game on Tabletop is welcome to anyone. So I like that element that they're welcome to anyone who wants to launch a game on their platform right now. They're also both GameFound and Game on Tabletop are viable as pledge managers. So if you run your game on Kickstarter, which I would say is still the best platform for any type of crowdfunder to use, if you launch it there and then you can kind of test out these other platforms from the pledge manager perspective, that's after the campaign if people want to post a late pledge. Dan also says, how did your experience living in Kyoto shape you as a game designer? Is there a distinctive Japanese game aesthetic? That's a great question. There's some questions here that show that you all have really done your research, and I really appreciate that. I did indeed study abroad in Kyoto in Japan my junior year of college. I had a wonderful time there. I even designed a game while I was there as a class project. I would say that at least consciously, my time in Japan has not really impacted me as a designer or a publisher. I had many great experiences there, but I don't know if they have really impacted me, with two small exceptions. One being that my first game that I designed before viticulture that didn't end up working out was, I think, called Kyoto, and it was based on a geisha in Kyoto, and essentially, I don't even remember the mechanism at this point. I think it was a worker placement game, but it didn't work out, and so I ended up designing viticulture instead. I often forget about that. And also, I developed a friendship in Japan with someone who coincidentally would end up being a game designer and publisher, and now is a great friend in the industry. His name is Eduardo Barath. He runs Pencil First Games. So almost entirely detached from my exact experience in Japan came a great friendship, and so we talk now and then as publishers to learn from each other. Me and Ed do. The last question from Dan is, you have shared your recollections of game design as a child and invited others to share their memories with you. What have you learned from others about children as game designers? My main experiences from this come from my little scythe and my nieces and nephews. I don't have any kids of my own. I have cats instead, as you can see in the background here. The main thing that came to mind when I saw this question, Dan, is that what I learned as a kid designing games and what I've heard from other parents whose children are trying to design games is that it's really helpful to find a game that the child enjoys and then have them make their own version of it, but make sure that it's not identical to it. For example, on a very recent radio call-in show, we had a really neat call from a 10-year-old who called into the show. I think his father or mother was helping him out with the call, but he called into the show to say that he was designing a game based on Star Realms, but he was changing up a few different things. I think he was using an ant theme, and he had a very small variation on Star Realms. And I think that's great, that he took a game that already existed. He wasn't starting from scratch. He took a game that existed, and he was iterating on it and learning from that iteration process. I think another thing a child could do is work on an expansion for a game they love. I think that's a great way to get started as a kid who's trying out their game design chops. Thank you, Dan, for your questions. On to Chris here. Chris says, how do you test the fun of a game when playtesting? When does it enter your testing, and are there times that it should not be considered? Yeah, two great questions there. I would say the first question is, I think about fun, kind of a gut instinct, whether or not I'm having fun, if I see other players having fun when we're doing local playtesting, when I'm a part of the playtest. Also, when I do blind playtesting, which is when I send out the files for our games to playtesters worldwide to learn the rules and print out and play the games with their friends without me there to supervise, I ask them to rank the game or rate the game from 1 to 10 in their playtest report. So I can see based on their feedback whether or not they had fun. Chris's other part of the question was, are there times where fun should not be considered? And while I think I pretty much always have fun in mind, because fun is the heart of what I want to get to with a game, I would say early on it's a little bit more about functionality. I'll often sit down with a game with my team here in St. Louis, and I'll say, okay, this playtest isn't really about anything other than seeing if these parts move. I need some other human bodies here at the table to make decisions to see if these things work, if it functions. So early on, it's a little bit more about that. And then later on, it almost becomes more about balance. So in the last stage of blind playtesting, I still am interested in the fun and the joy that players are having, but I really am more focused on the balance at that point in time. Chris also asked, have you made a game to teach an idea? I can't say I've really done that. I would say the closest I've come to that, and actually I'm not the designer of this game, I'm the developer of it, is Between Two Cities. Between Two Cities and Between Two Castles, I don't know if this was the intent in the design, but they really do teach communication skills quite well and partnership skills, because you have to work with two different players to build the cities or castles, depending on the game, to make them as good as possible, to score as many points as possible. So I think that's the closest game that came to mind for that particular question, Chris. Nathan has some questions. He says, what are some of your favorite games? I post a lot of top 10 lists, and I do top 10 lists about my favorite games twice a year. My most recent list had a few different games. It had Dune Imperium at the top of the list as my favorite game right now. And other games on that list also included The Quacks of Quedlinburg, Role Player, and Ra as some of my favorite games right now. Nathan asked, do I have a daily routine that helps me stay focused? I do have a daily schedule, essentially. I get up around 7 o'clock in the morning. I work from home, and so almost immediately I am working. Around 7:15, I start working. I work up until lunch. I take an intentional lunch break, and then I work from lunch until dinner. And then after dinner, I come back to work and usually have some creative time. Usually, if I haven't had design time during the day, I try to reserve an hour or so in the evening to have some design time. So it's usually around a 10 to 12 hour workday, broken up by meals. I would say I have more of a weekly pattern in that on Monday, based on media really that I'm creating. On Monday, I have a blog post for Stonemeyer Games. On Thursday, I have a blog post for Stonemeyer Games. On Tuesday, I film a bunch of videos. I film game design videos and top 10 list style videos, usually between 1 and 3 videos, depending on what I played that week. Wednesday, I have my Facebook Live session in the morning. And Friday, I give myself a media break and usually often have a little bit more time for game design on Fridays. And Saturday and Sundays, I intentionally don't do any interviews and things like that. I just don't do that on the weekends. During the week, if at most, I'll do 1 interview or podcast appearance, that type of thing per day. And then weekends, I take a break from that and oftentimes focus more on game design and development on the weekends. Nathan also says, would you say that you invest in ideas or people more? And I would revise the question a little bit. I don't invest, I think, in ideas at all. I'm really not that interested in ideas all that much at all. I'm interested in execution and I'm interested in people. So absolutely, when I hired Joe and Alex to work for Stonemeyer Games, I invested in them because I trusted them and I believed they could do great things for Stonemeyer Games. So I invested in them as people. And for designers who submit ideas or games to us, specifically not ideas, I'm interested in what they've created. I'm interested in the execution. If someone comes to me with an idea that is, I would say, almost literally worthless to me. I think it's great that people have ideas. I have ideas myself, but it only matters when I actually execute on those ideas. Nathan also says, do you have any advice for making a game stand out? It's kind of a two-pronged advice here. It's really, for me, all about the hook. What is the hook of the game? What is the mechanical hook? And it's on different levels. What's the mechanical hook? What's different about it from other games in terms of the mechanisms? What's the thematic hook? What about the theme is a twist on what's already out there? What is a component hook? What's a special component that's in the game that I haven't seen in other games, or at least will stand out and have great table presence in the game? Those are maybe the top 3. And to understand what those hooks are, I think you also need to know a lot about the game design industry. You need to know what games are already out there. Whether or not you've actually played those games or just researched them from blogs and podcasts and YouTube channels. You can get your information in different ways. But I think knowing what's out there helps to find what could be a hook in your game that isn't already in another game. A couple more questions from Nathan. Actually, this question was asked by Nathan, Dan, Jamey, and Ahu. What is your design or creative process? I'll give it to you really quickly. There's also a video on my YouTube channel about the 10 steps to design a game. But it often starts with an idea. Then when I brainstorm that idea, whether that idea is based on the mechanisms or a mechanical idea or a thematic idea, on pencil and paper brainstorming, I am meshing together the themes that meet the mechanical idea that I have or mechanisms that meet the thematic idea that I have. I then start to work on the first prototype, and I try to get that prototype to the table, and then I playtest it locally. I iterate on it. I prototype it again. I playtest it again. I do that until the game is fun and functional and relatively balanced, and then I enter blind playtesting. And I usually do around 3 to 5 waves of blind playtesting. Again, playtesters around the world giving me feedback about the game until I think that the game is the best that it can be from the blind playtesting process. Nathan says, how many failed projects have never taken off? I would say 99% of at least the ideas that I've had never become anything. Some percentage of that actually gets to the table. So maybe of all the ideas that I've had, maybe 20% of them get to the kind of an in-depth brainstorming process. Maybe a few of those games actually get to the first prototype. And then of those first prototypes, I put out 7 games at this point over the course of 9 years. So very few games that I actually go deep into end up making it to, or very few games that have an idea end up actually making it to the production process. Finally, Nathan says, what motivates me? I would say my initial answer was joy. Bringing joy to tabletops worldwide is the mission here at Stonemeyer Games and is my mission every day. And I would also add inclusion to that because I think joy doesn't really matter if people don't feel included. And I think that extends to a lot of different elements of games, but inclusion in a variety of different aspects is very much a motivation for me. Tom says, what tips do you have for teaching a prototype game to new players? So my recommendation here is don't. So if people are playtesting your prototype with you, they are doing you a huge favor. And I would try to respect their time as much as possible. And one way that you can do that is not have a long rules explanation. This is both from the game design perspective and how you actually present the game to the players. I would recommend explaining a few core concepts of the game, and then within 5 minutes, if you are not taking turns within 5 minutes, that's a problem. I would highly recommend both designing the game and figuring out a way to introduce it to players so that you can say a few core concepts and then jump right in and start taking turns, even if that means that you are taking turns for other players, either completely taking it for them or guiding them through their first few turns as you explain more concepts by using those turns as examples. Also, one thing that I think helps a lot is as players, when you get to the point in the game, maybe 10, 15 minutes in, 20 minutes in, when players are starting to make their own decisions, compliment them. All the time. Make them feel good about what they're doing. Again, they're doing you a huge favor. If they do something clever in the game, compliment them. Make them feel good for the decisions they're making, and compliment them in focus ways so that they can start to see the different layers of the strategy. Or really, as they start to see those layers of strategy and make decisions based on them, you can have that. You can kind of reinforce that through compliments. Tom says, I'm a designer who's made some smaller, lighter games in the past. How do you even start designing a heavier game like Scythe or Tapestry? And I start somewhere. I don't have a great answer for that. I start somewhere. I think maybe the best advice I can give if you want to design a heavier game is throw a bunch of stuff into the pot, and basically start with too much. Start with too many ideas, and make it too complex of a game at first, and then start cutting stuff from it. And you might even still end up with a lighter or medium weight game. That is totally fine. That's probably even good, but I think it's okay to take a bunch of different ideas and throw them in and say, okay, this is where I'm starting, and then cut out stuff after that. Jonathan says, do you think there are board game genres that are yet to be discovered? Any idea on what they might be or what they might involve? And Jonathan mentions a classic example of deck building being one of the great mechanisms of the last decade that has been iterated many different times. I am sure there are genres of games that haven't been discovered yet. My game design channel often touches upon very specific mechanical ideas, and I think any one of those ideas, the many hundreds of ideas that I've seen, oftentimes they're very specific, could eventually spawn genres of games. I don't know if they'll be as big as deck building, but there are many ideas like that out there, or that have been implemented in games, not just ideas. I will say, it's hard, I don't know what the next great idea is. I don't know what the next great mechanism is. But I will say that from my experience, every idea that ends up being interesting hasn't been an idea that I just thought of and put into a prototype and it magically worked. Really, every idea that has ended up being memorable in my games has been something that emerged from playtesting, something I tried in playtesting or maybe iterated while we were actively playtesting the game, and I realized, oh wow, that's actually really fun. That works differently than I thought, or that this works really, really well from that playtest, and then I iterate from there. That's been the case pretty much for every clever mechanism that I've ever stumbled upon. It's come from playtesting, not from just my head and ended up magically in the game. Jonathan also says, what's your most common source of ideas? He says, I know with Red Rising, which I do have with me as an example, he says, I know with Red Rising you mentioned that you liked the rummy mechanisms of Fantasy Realms. Is it often like that being inspired by a mechanism from a game you like? And I would say often it is. Yeah, I play a lot of games. I consume a lot of board game content. I'm inspired by other publishers and other designers. And that is very much often the case, that I'm inspired by another game. Oftentimes a tabletop game, sometimes a video game. I don't play a lot of video games, but I do watch video game reviews in the same way I watch tabletop game reviews to learn from them. And I'm also motivated and inspired by works of fiction. TV shows, movies, books. I consume fiction all the time, and they often give me thematic ideas for games. Jonathan says, also, what are you looking for in terms of games pitched to Stonemeyer? Really, there are a lot of elements that we're looking for. You can see the submissions page on the Stonemeyer Games website, and I would recommend that in general. If you're looking to pitch a game to a specific publisher, go to the submission page on their website and see specifically what they're looking for. At Stonemeyer Games, a few of the things that we're looking for are games. Well, really, we'll only even consider games that can be played from 1 to 5 players. We're looking for those hooks that I mentioned earlier. We're looking for a mechanical hook, a thematic hook, a component hook. We're looking for accessibility. We're looking for the type of game that you can teach in a few minutes, or at least have players start taking turns in a few minutes, and the complexity can emerge from there. And we're looking for event games. I know we have we're kind of pushing that boundary a little bit with shorter games like the very recent Rolling Realms, which is a 30 to 45 minute game. But in general, we are looking for the type of game that will be the main feature of a game night, not like a filler that you play at the beginning or the end of the night, and also not the type of game that takes so long that you need to set aside a full day to play. Vince and Dan, in fact, Vince has two overlapping questions with Dan. Vince says, how do you balance your numbers and stats in game design? And it's really a two-pronged approach. One is figuring out the math fairly early on. I don't, from like the first few playtests of a game, I'm not trying to figure out the math, but eventually I try to have an economic system in the game where, like, if I have coins in the game, if I have money in some way and I have resources, I try to convert the money to the resources and vice versa. So 1 stone might be worth 2 coins, whereas 1 wheat might be worth only 1 coin. And I then have that math to figure out. I figured that out fairly early on in the playtesting process. The other side of it is data analysis. So on the back end, when we're getting all these playtester reports, all this data from blind playtesters, I work with a data analyst to look at that data and figure out what I'm not seeing in that data. I look at that data as well, but the data analyst digs pretty deep into that data to look at outliers, especially if there's asymmetry in the game. We're looking at things that like with this specific faction, it's overpowered in this circumstance, or it's underpowered in this circumstance, things like that. Vince and Dan also asked, do you prefer to start with a theme or game mechanisms when starting a new game, and why? For me, it's a mix of both. I've had games that I started with, like with Scythe. With Scythe, I actually was inspired originally by the art and the world itself that Jakob was building, and I designed a game based on that theme and that art. There are other games that started with a mechanical idea, where I wanted to start with a specific mechanism, worker placement in viticulture, and I branched out from there. The key for me, though, is in the brainstorming process. If I have a thematic idea, almost right away in the brainstorming process, I am thinking about mechanisms that work for that theme, and vice versa. So it almost, I would say, for me, doesn't really matter if I start with a theme or mechanisms, because my process is to try to mix the two from the very start of the process. Dan says, what testing methods do you use? Do I have a set group? Locally, I often play test with my team, my co-founder Alan, my co-workers Alex and Joe. I play test with them locally quite a bit, and there are times where I also invite friends over to play test. I often feel a little bad having friends play tested if the game isn't yet fun. I've tried to get to the point where the game is at least where I'm having fun with the game enough to want to share it and not put others through the agony that can be an early playtest where the game just is not functioning well. But I don't mind putting my coworkers through that. Also, then there's the blind playtesting process. So I have a group of people. There's a group of people called Stonemeyer ambassadors, people who have volunteered their time for Stonemeyer games. And from that bigger list, every couple of years, I send out a test to those who want to be playtesters. It's a test that I use to determine if I think someone will be a good playtester or not, because I think there's certain skills that make a good playtester. There's certain skills that don't make a great playtester. And from that list, I have a very short list, maybe 75 people or so around the world who are great lead playtesters. And so I send out the files for games to those lead playtesters and have them playtest various games and expansions and things like that. Dan also says, do I use a developer or do I act as my own? So for those who don't know, game designers are the ones that come up with the ideas, who create the initial prototypes for the games, who playtest the games locally quite a bit, and write the rule books, and basically get the game like 80% ready. And great designers can even get the game closer than that. Oftentimes then, they will either at that point submit a game to a publisher or bring in a developer to help them figure out that final 80%. To get the game, to make the game even more fun, even more intuitive, even more balanced, even more accessible. And that's what a developer does. For my own games, I often do end up acting as a developer, but I lean on our playtesters a little bit for that. They are still the playtesters are mostly focusing on identifying what really works well and what really does not work well. They're sharing examples with me instead of finding solutions. But some of our playtesters are really good too at, after they share that example, they might have a specific idea for how to fix that example or fix that problem. And so playtesters become developers of a sort. But in the end, I am taking all that information and deciding how to fix the game or not. I'm acting as a developer. For any game that we're publishing that I am not the designer for, I also act as the developer for. So I am both a designer and a developer in that way, depending on the game. Dan says, when do you decide if a gameplay mechanism just doesn't work? Sometimes it's tough to do that because sometimes I have something that I think should work and it just isn't working. And eventually I either have to tweak it enough so that it does work, or I come to terms with the fact that it isn't fun and has never been fun and I just need to cut it. Or also I focus on the intuitive nature of that mechanism. Sometimes the mechanism actually can be a lot of fun, but it's really hard to explain or to remember to players, or for players to actually remember how it works. And so if it never gets to that point where it can be explained and remembered in an intuitive way, I end up cutting it. So I'm constantly just paying attention to whether or not it's fun and paying attention to whether or not it's actually intuitive. Dan's last question was, do you have a series of designs in various states of progress? So as a publishing company, yes, we have games and expansions at various states of the process at all times. For me as a designer specifically, I found that 2 games is my sweet spot. I like to have 2 games going at any given time, and ideally not at the exact same stage of the design process. And I do that because I found that I can get burned out on a game if I don't have something else to work on at any given time. And I'm very much a human being. I get excited about certain things at certain times and not other things at other times. So oftentimes I'm excited about one game and not as excited at that given time about another one. Or I've maybe just worked a little bit too much on one game and need to take a break from it and work on another game for a little while. That's how I personally have found a method that works for me. I've even found that 3 games is too many for me to be designing at any given time. Right now, in particular, I have 2 games that I'm working on, but I really should be working on 3, but I just can't. I can't work on more than 2 at a time. I need to get one of my games to a certain level in a certain stage really in the blind playtesting process for me to be able to focus on 2 different games instead. Another Jamey here. I'm a Jamey. This is a Jamey, Jamie instead of EY. Jamey says, what makes a great game? For me, a great game is one that brings joy to people. That's my mission. I want to bring joy to tabletops worldwide. For me specifically, I like games that have a certain level of agency. I like to have control over my decisions in games, even if there is a push your luck element or some element of luck or variation, a blind card draw. I don't mind that as long as I have a decent amount of agency in the games that I play. Jamey also says, I really like this question, what gotchas have you run into in your gaming career? How did you get past those hurdles? I have many, many blog posts about mistakes that I've made and lessons that I've learned. There are many different ways that I could have answered this question. Some quick examples is back in my Kickstarter days, budgeting accuracy. So there were some close calls along the way with viticulture in particular, the first viticulture campaign back in 2012, and even a few campaigns that followed that, where if we had hit like a certain stretch goal, it would have, basically I had put stretch goals in there that shouldn't be in the campaign because they would have added so much to the cost of making each unit of the game. So budgeting gotchas, proofreading oversight. So this is something that I've learned more and more over the years. I've added layer upon layer to our proofreading process because along the way we have missed things at various steps of the process. I have a great team of proofreaders that I outsource our games to, and we still miss things. There's still like little things that we miss. Like in Wingspan, for example, in the original printing of Wingspan, there were some cards that we basically made one small revision very late in the process. And my graphic designer made a little mistake where she added an extra E to one of the words. I'm forgetting what the word was at this point, but there was an extra E added to that word and it was added globally. It was a global change by accident. And so I think 15 cards in the original version of Wingspan had an extra E in a certain word. They were still perfectly fine, but that E got added. And we didn't catch that in proofreading because it was such a late revision. And so long story short, I've tried to add many, many layers to the proofreading process, even very late stage last minute checks of things to make sure that we've caught everything. And last, I mentioned earlier, data analysis. That's been a fairly recent change over the last couple of years at Stonemeyer Games because of Tapestry in general. Tapestry was designed to be as balanced as possible, but I also designed it as a living game. I knew that players would discover strategies that I hadn't considered, that playtesters hadn't discovered. And so on an ongoing basis, we collect data about Tapestry and use that data to make small tweaks to the civilizations. However, I wish we could have analyzed that playtesting data even better up front. I analyzed it pretty well, I think, but there are experts at this. I like to hire experts who are experts in their fields, and I should have hired an analyst to look at that data for Tapestry and find things that I can't see as someone who is not a data analyst, to catch some of those asymmetric imbalances before we even publish the game. Those are some like a small percentage of the many gotchas that I've encountered over the years of running a publishing company and being a designer. Megan says, what tips can you offer for generating a successful crowdfunding campaign? A couple different layers here to this answer. One is, my number one starting tip is to go back other crowdfunding campaigns and view them from the eyes of a potential creator. I think you'll learn so much that way by looking at the project page through the lens of a potential creator and following the updates from the lens of a potential creator. I think that can help so much. Two, read my Kickstarter lessons blog or my book. The book costs money, the blog is free. There is a ton of information there with the intent of helping potential creators avoid all the mistakes that I've made and to have a successful crowdfunding campaign. It's there as a resource for you. It's a lot of information. So start today. If you think someday, 2-3 years down the road, you might want to run a crowdfunding campaign, start reading the blog now, because there's like 8 years of content on there at this point, maybe even 9 years of content on there. But some very specific things to think about. The things that generally make a successful campaign are to create a compelling product. The product really does matter. You can have a great campaign, but if the product isn't exciting, the product page doesn't matter all that much. But the project page also matters. Create an attractive project page that engages people, that invites people to the project. Have fair pricing for the value of what people are getting. I see too many projects these days with really, really high prices. For potentially a good reason that I'll go into in a minute, but I think the price really does matter quite a bit. And also, get people excited about your game before, or your product, whatever it may be, before you launch the crowdfunding campaign. If there isn't much buzz for the product or the project before you launch, that buzz isn't magically going to happen on day one. So start to generate that buzz by sharing your project and your product well in advance of the actual Kickstarter launch. Right now, there's a project on Kickstarter called Mythwind. I've been seeing ads for Mythwind and information about Mythwind on their blog posts through e-newsletters for probably 6 months now, and it got me excited. These little nuggets along the way got me excited about it. I think that's a great strategy. Dave says, I love this question, Dave. This is a great question. Dave says, in a March 2018 blog post, you expressed some ambivalence about the value of college education. You propose that college is, quote, largely a stepping stone towards a successful career. How are you feeling these days about college education? How would you recommend that students use their time with us to make the most of what we have to offer? So Dave, I'm actually, as I'm reading this, I'm not sure if you are a teacher or a student, but the advice I have is more for students. Here's the advice I have if you are in college right now. One, take a foreign language and take it seriously. I think college is a great time to learn a foreign language, or at least create the foundation for learning a foreign language. And as part of that, I highly recommend studying abroad. I think that's a little tougher right now during the pandemic, but my time in college, taking Japanese seriously and studying abroad in Kyoto was incredibly foundational for me. And I think that was a great way to spend that year in my life. I don't think I could have done that later in my life. Once you get into a career, there will be very few chances where you can take 3 to 4 months, or ideally 6 to 8 months, and just go study abroad somewhere. College is a great time to do that. I also think, I kind of wish that I had focused more on finding the best professors, the best teachers at my university, and going to their classes. Even if I didn't care about the subject, I think a great teacher can make any subject interesting and compelling and memorable, and make it stick. So I wish I had focused more on finding great professors rather than finding a certain career path, or even thinking that I knew what my career path would be at that point. And also, I did this a little bit, but I wish I had focused on interesting classes, focusing on like selecting classes based on how interesting they were to me rather than, again, what I thought might be useful for my career. Because what I thought was going to be my career, something related to international business, has really ended up having no impact on what I've done for my career at all, or the 3 careers I've had. This is my 3rd career so far. 2 other things. One, I highly recommend selecting one very specific skill and mastering it in college. I like a very, very specific skill. Find something that you want to be really, really good at and get good at whatever that is. Even if it doesn't involve your formal education at all, just pick something that you want to be really good at and master it. And last, I wish I had played a lot more board games in college. That seems like, looking back, it would have been a great time to play a lot of board games. I played a bit of Hearts. Like, we played kind of a weekly game of Hearts. We played a lot of Mario Kart. But looking back, I'm like, what was I doing? Why wasn't I playing board games every night in college? Because I really had the time and the opportunity to do so. So play a lot of board games. Those are my tips, I think, to get a lot out of college. That said, I am far removed from college at this point. I'm 40. I went to college 20 years ago. So it might be very different these days. Your college and university might vary. But yeah, those are my tips. Great question. Thank you for asking that. Randall says, how do we make use of games in education without killing the fun of the game? Don't kill the fun. I actually read this question a little bit differently while I was preparing for this. I thought you were asking about how to design an educational game, and my tip for you was to look at a company called Genius Games. I think they do a fantastic job of creating fun, engaging games that are also educational. But how do you make use of games in education without killing the fun of the game? I would say pick the right game. I think it comes down to picking the right game. And there are many great modern games that you can use in education, use in the classroom. And even games, I mentioned Between Two Cities and Between Two Castles earlier. They teach communication and partnership. And they are also, I think, great games to play. So I think pretty much any modern board game, if you play it from the lens of a teacher, you can find something that students can take away and learn from that game as you play it in the classroom. Emily has 2 great questions here. First, what important skills do you think are developed in designers through the active creation of games in comparison to playing or studying them? Yeah, 3 different layers here. The things that you learn from playing a game versus the things you learn from studying games, like watching YouTube videos about games, or reading about games, listening to podcasts about games, and actively creating games. I will say overall, I think a little bit of both, or a little bit of all those things is helpful. I learned different things from watching game videos, from playing games, and from designing games. For me, for the actual creation of creative process of creating games, I found that the personal investment in the game makes a big difference. Like when I play someone else's game, if it's not my own game night, I want players to have fun, but that fun doesn't gnaw away at me at night. But when I design a game and I'm having players play it, I really, really, like, the fun of that game is really personally important to me. I want them to have a good time playing the game. And it hurts more when it isn't fun, but that's good motivation for me to actually make the game more fun and more balanced and more intuitive. Also, and this is hard for me to really put my finger on, but I'll give an example for it. I think the process of designing a game can make you realize how difficult it is to actually design a game. For example, for years now, I have tried to design either a deck building or a bag building game. And despite my love of many great deck building games and analyzing many great deck building and bag building games, I have been unable to do so. So it has given me new respect, new layers and levels of respect for every designer who is able to design a deck building or a bag building game, because I have tried to do so and I can't figure it out. So even if that's the only outcome that you get from designing a game, I think it can give you more respect for designers who design it in a certain genre or a certain mechanism. Emily also asked, how do you recognize and contend with your cultural situatedness, and how does this affect the games that you design? How do you consider and design for the different context that players may be coming from? I love this question, especially in terms of how we try to be inclusive here at Stonemeyer Games. A few different quick answers here. One is a layer of, and I use the word superficial, but not really in a bad way here, superficial diversity, which is having like characters. And part of what I'm going to say here is solutions rather than just the lens itself, but I think the two go hand in hand. So one of the things we do at Stonemeyer Games is try to have a lot of diversity among the characters in our games. If you look at Charterstone, each of the 6 main characters that players can play as have different ethnicities, they're different ages. One of them has a physical disability, and different genders, of course, different genders. So I try to include that little layer of superficial diversity in games because I think that's a good start. It isn't everything, but I think that's a good start. I also try to have playtesters of different backgrounds. So I kind of acknowledge that I have my own lens, my own background as a straight white male, and I try to find playtesters who don't fit that mold. Some of them do, but some of them don't, because I want to get different perspectives. I mentioned the cultural consulting earlier. That's been really helpful as well. Hiring someone whose job is really to know sensitive topics in a bunch of different cultures around the world and what might be triggers for people in different cultures if they're playing our games. Try to again, prevent unintentional harm. I also try to play a lot of different games and consume content from different types of creators. So these are 2 different layers here. I don't try to just play the same type of game that's been created by the same type of person. I try to play a lot of different games from different types of designers, and at the same time, I try to consume content from creators, like content creators, bloggers, YouTubers, who have different backgrounds than I do, so I can see through their lens how they are perceiving games. And last, one little example here is that I am not colorblind. And so I try to use both me and my graphic designer try to use a colorblind app and also colorblind playtesters when we're creating games so that we can ensure that our games are colorblind friendly. So we're always trying to find more perspectives, more lenses to look through when we're designing our games to make them more inclusive. Great question there. Duncan says, what elements of a game do you find the hardest to work with or create? This is a tough one because there's a lot that I still struggle with as a designer. I mentioned deck building earlier, but one little thing that came to mind is I still struggle a lot to come up with lots of unique cards. Like that is a skill that I admire in other designers. For example, one of the reasons that Wingspan originally was really exciting for me when Elizabeth pitched it to me was that she had already designed 100 different bird cards where the themes and the mechanisms of those cards were unique and meshed together really, really well. That is a skill that I admire and that I appreciate and that I covet a bit. I wish I could be better at that. So that is a skill that I wish I could be better at. Duncan also says, are there any background elements of game creation that are not included in the final result but you feel are important to the planning stages? This question as phrased was kind of difficult for me, Duncan, because pretty much everything that we do, whether it's up front or behind the scenes, ends up in the final product in some way. The only thing I could think of is that we often do test components that don't end up in the final game for various reasons, whether or not we find a fancier version of that component or a less fancy version based on whether it fits into the game box or if it fits into the budget, things like that. I do have a new series on my YouTube channel where I go back and look at components that we considered during the design, development, and playtesting process. And I look at things that worked and didn't work, and I talk through that. So check out a few videos about that on my YouTube channel if you're interested in that subject. Katie says, what trends have I noticed in the board game industry that seem like direct reactions to the pandemic? Yeah, this has been on my mind a lot over the last year and a half. And some of these things, I don't think we've even seen these trends emerge yet because so many games created during the pandemic won't be released until 2022, maybe not even 2023. A few trends, though, that I think we'll see emerge is I think we'll see even more games that offer solo play or games designed specifically for 2 players. I think we'll see even more games designed specifically for 2 players or even games that are designed only for solo play. I think we're going to see smaller boxes. Smaller game boxes, games packed as tightly as possible because of the increase in freight shipping, which I think is a side effect of the pandemic. We've seen freight shipping prices go way up. And if you can pack more games into a carton, more games into a shipping container, then you can ship more cost effectively. One trend I've noticed is I've seen higher prices on games because I think creators are hoping that shipping prices will go down, hoping that production prices will go down, but they're planning for the worst. And so they're offering these higher prices on Kickstarter and beyond. And also, one thing that I focused on a lot is in Rolling Realms in particular, I focused on remote play, games that you can easily play remotely with friends and people, whether they're in your city or around the world, that you can't play with in person at given times or certain times, but you want to connect with them remotely. I think games that have that remote playability, I think we'll see more and more games like that. And Rolling Realms is an example. Katie also says, if I could go back in time, which classes should a college student take in order to prepare for working in the board game industry? This ties a little bit to the question that was asked earlier in more of a general sense. One thing that I would recommend, so I mentioned like picking a skill and mastering it. One skill I think that is really, really helpful for game design is graphic design. I don't think you need to be a master at graphic design to be a game designer, but it really does help to have some rudimentary graphic design skills, some knowledge of either Photoshop or InDesign in particular, can really help with the prototyping process. So I highly recommend that. Beyond that, though, I would recommend, especially while you're in college or just out of college, I would recommend picking a game company, a publisher that you really admire and that you think will be around for 5-10 years at least, who's been around for a while, will be around for a while. Pick a company and volunteer for them. And kind of visibly volunteer for them. Like join their Discord channel, join their Facebook groups, join discussions on their blog. Be a visible face for that company for a long time. Find things that the company is not good at, identify those things, and be an active part of the solution of making that company better as a volunteer. Because someday you might want to work for that company, and if you show up out of the blue and like if you've kind of been behind the scenes, a fan behind the scenes, and you show up out of the blue and say, hey, I've been a fan for a long time, I'd love to work for you, that's great. But you haven't really established any relationship, any trust with that company. This is a chance in college to pick one or two companies, maybe not even just one, but one or two companies, maybe three, and give of your time and your talent and your expertise to that company so that they know who you are when the time comes that maybe they're looking for someone who is really good at X, Y, and Z, and you've already shown that you are good at those things. That might make you applicable to be hired by that company, or at least a visible applicant for that company. Andrew says, during the early design process, how do you differentiate between Jamey likes this idea and people will like this game idea? And really, I think both are good. I think it's, whether it's Jamey or you as a designer, I want to be excited about the games that I'm working on. So it's important for me to like the ideas and the execution. I also think it's good to have an outward focus. In the end, even though I'm the one that designing the game, I'm the one who will probably play the game and teach the game a lot. There are way more people who will play the game way more times than I ever will. And so I try to keep my focus on them. What will be fun and interesting and innovative and unique for other people when they play the game? I don't really know how I differentiate between the two, but yeah, the two are often on my mind. One slight example maybe is that I do watch a lot of game reviews. So I'm always trying to see what other people are thinking about games, their lens, how they appreciate and look at games. And sometimes that even influences me a little bit too much. Like I designed Scythe, this is a crazy example here. I designed Scythe partially because I wanted Richard Ham, to have a good time playing it with his wife. He often talks about how he plays games 2 players with Jen, and they don't like games with a lot of conflict, where the things that you do can hurt the other player. And so I made a game with combat where you don't actually destroy anything. You don't kill anything, you don't destroy anything. And I designed that with that in mind. And then Richard found out what the game was, and he decided not to play it. It wasn't for him. And so I focused on this one particular reviewer in the hopes that I would make a game that he would enjoy, not necessarily to get a good review out of it, but because I respect Rahdo. I like that philosophy. I relate to that philosophy. And he didn't even end up designing it. So I would recommend not focusing too much on any one specific reviewer when you design games, as I did with Scythe. Andrew has a couple good questions here. He says, his second question is, I've listened to novelists talk about balancing the familiar with the strange and how a new novelist needs to be wary of how much strange the reader needs to grapple with in a single book. But an experienced novelist, as Andrew points out, has often earned reader trust and can get away with more. Do you feel the same applies to new veteran game designers, or is a game's complexity too different from a novel's plotting? I think this is a really interesting observation, or a really interesting corollary between game design and novels. And I had to think about it a little bit, but I think, Andrew, what you're hinting at, I think you have a great point here in that there are certain game designers who have found their audience. They found the people that really connect with their games, even though I think there are certain elements of their games that maybe don't connect with a much broader audience. Two examples of this are Cole Wehrle and Vital Lacerda. Both create highly complex thematic games that I think break a lot of game design rules, basically. But they have found their audience. They have found the people who really connect with that style of game. Cole through Root and Vast, and now Oath, and Vital Lacerda through a vast variety of games like Kanban and Lisboa. They have found their audience, and they have gone deep with their audience. And I think that's great. They're very successful at what they do because they have found their audience. But for a new designer, I think it's great for you to start to find that audience. But if you came out of the gate with an Oath, I don't know if a publisher would even consider you. I don't even know if you would have success as a self-publisher on Kickstarter if you came out with a game like that, because there's so many things it does that just don't make game design sense. People would see those things and say, this will not work. I don't think this will work. And so you might want to come out of the gate with something a little more familiar, but still have a really great hook or several hooks to it, rather than go crazy with that game. And then once you build that trust with your audience, once you find your audience, you can go deep with that audience. The last question here from Andrew was, famous schools for art and design have often developed unique styles associated with those schools. For example, Bauhaus graduates produced work that was identifiably Bauhaus. If you had to choose, would you prefer a university game design program to produce a highly refined and strongly identifiable body of work, or would you prefer to see a broad and eclectic output? For me, absolutely eclectic. I want to see innovation. I want to see things that are different. Even if it is something that's familiar, but then there's a really interesting twist on it, I love to see that. But broad and eclectic is much more interesting for me. The last set of questions here are from Ahu. Ahu says, what do you think about the different audiences? Do your games target different people? And I would say to a certain extent, yes. Like while we aim for event games that scale from 1 to 5 players, often more than 5 players, our games do have different ages, or they target slightly different age audiences. Like My Little Scythe might target a slightly younger audience, while Scythe itself might target an older audience. We have that player count range. We have game length. So we have games that are shorter, like Rolling Realms, Between Two Cities, are usually around 30 minutes, while we have a game like Scythe that is generally around, around 90 minutes to almost 2 hours. So I do try to target different people through that, but I do try to make our games accessible to a pretty broad range of people. Who also says, how do you design the overall complexity of the game while staying true to the main concept and mechanisms? For me, I mostly think about it, and I mentioned this earlier in the answers, I mostly think about it in terms of the onboarding process. I love emergent complexity, but I really like that word emergent. I like that you don't need to sit through a 30-minute rules explanation to learn one of our games. I like that you can understand some core concepts and then start to take turns very early in the game and then learn step by step as you're playing. So that's how I think about complexity. I think about complexity in terms of onboarding. Last, Ahu asked, and I have this game here because I've been referencing it the whole time. Ahu has, how do I design an expansion? Or do you design a base game accordingly implementing potential expansions into design considerations? For me, my design process is that I try to put every good idea I have, every idea that actually works, into the core game. I don't leave anything. I don't leave any scraps for expansions. I don't cut anything for expansions unless it's truly something that doesn't work, and then it doesn't end up in an expansion anyway. For me, though, that often means that when I get to a time in the game's lifespan for there to be an expansion, I don't have any ideas left. I've kind of already exhausted all the ideas I had for that game. That isn't always the case, but that is often the case. And so what I often do is I look to fans. For example, for The Rise of Fenris, Ryan, my co-designer for the game, had created a campaign system, a campaign expansion for The Rise of Fenris. He had playtested it, he had written the rules for it, he had posted it publicly, and people were playing it and offering him feedback on it. And that's when I stumbled upon it and was like, wow, this is really, really cool. I love what Ryan's doing here. This gives me some ideas for what I want to do with an expansion. It didn't end up being the same campaign at all that Ryan had made, but by doing that, by posting it publicly, by testing it himself, Ryan demonstrated that he was an excellent writer and a great narrative artist, essentially. He had no design experience before that, but it made him a great co-design partner to work with on the expansion. So for many of our expansions, they come from fans posting ideas that they have And not just ideas, things that they have actually executed, written the rulebooks for, and playtested at least a little bit and posted publicly. They didn't come to me privately, they posted it publicly and said, here's what I've been working on, what do you think? And I discovered it that way and ended up working on them. That was the case for the Wind Gambit. The My Little Scythe stemmed from that a little bit, even though it wasn't an expansion. The upcoming Tapestry expansion came from a co-design process like that. Red Rising ended up being a co-design. That's again a core game, not an expansion. But this often happens for me for expansions, and I think that's a great way for me to discover how to level up a game through expansions. And it's also a great way, I think, for designers to get their foot in the industry. If they have a game that they're really passionate about, if you have a game that you're really passionate about, you could design a fan expansion for it, post it publicly, test it, write the rulebook, and see where it goes. The final product may end up being very different than where you started, but that's okay because you have your foot in the door at that point. You have a relationship with that publisher, that designer, and you can take it from there. I think that's it. This was longer than I thought, but I had a lot of fun answering these questions. I hope this wasn't too long for you. And I look forward to continuing the conversation on YouTube if you do have follow-up questions and ideas that you want to talk about there. Thanks. Bye.